Senate is about to gavel back into session to continue work today in an effort to end the fiscal stalemate. Now to the floor of the Senate for live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Move to a bill to raise the debt ceiling without any strings attached. The Republicans en bloc, voted against that. Well, as a result, since you need 60 votes to bring a bill to the floor, the vote was 53 to 45. So there should be no mistake in anyone's mind. This was a very clear vote, simply to move to a bill, fully debatable, amendable even. But the Republicans would not even vote to even go to that bill today. Quite frankly, I must admit that when I was driving into the Senate, I was thinking about this, and I thought, well, what we'll do is we'll get on the bill. Obviously, they'll vote for cloture to proceed to the bill. Then we'll get on the bill, and I was sort of wondering to myself, well, I wonder how long we'd have to be on the bill. I wonder what kind of amendments would be offered. And then would we have to file cloture on that bill also? I was quite surprised to see every Republican vote against even going to the bill. It begs credulity. I'm incredulous at this. Especially, here are the markets going to be opening in Asia later tomorrow and on Sunday. And how are they going to read this? I think if we had voted to at least move to the bill and debate it, it would have stabilized the market somewhat, because they say, well, at least they're willing to talk about it. Now they can look and just say, well, the Republicans simply are not going to discuss this. Shocking. Shocking that that would have transpired today at this last minute. No one gave up anything in the bill simply to move to the bill. And the Republicans said no. Well, Mr. President, we've been closed now for 2 weeks. I've come to the floor several times, I know as others have, to talk about this irresponsible and dangerous episode in our nation's history. Now I understand that different groups are coming together, trying to float some kind of an idea. Well, I hope something comes of it. And I truly hope that cooler heads will prevail and that we'll reach some agreement that will allow the government to reopen, allow the debt ceiling to be extended with no strings attached for at least a year or more, at least get us through the next elections of 2014. And then we got to go to negotiations. Our budget committee, we passed a budget here. The House passed this budget. They should go and meet and try to work it out in conference. Our appropriations committees, we passed our bills. The House, well, they haven't passed all of them. Then we can go to work and work these things out in the next, 6 weeks up till December the 1st, something like that. So I hope that works. I hope we get that kind of a compromise. But I do not want to see some kind of a compromise which says to one side or the other, you've got to do this or you've got to do that. It should be open. Our budget committee, under the able guidance and direction of Senator Murray of Washington, that budget committee, I'm not a member of that budget committee, but they ought to be able to go to conference without any strings attached, some artificial level put in there. They ought to take what we passed as a budget, just as the House did. But, Mr. President, what's happening now, and it's getting worse every day, another week, another 2 weeks, it's just unfathomable how many more people are going to be hurt. Now, a lot of Americans may think sequestration wasn't a big deal or closing the government wasn't. I saw a piece in the paper where some Tea Party people were meeting, and what came through is that, well, they weren't being directly hit or hurt by the government shutdown. And one respondent was quoted in the paper saying, we need to go back to the late 1800s, the way this country ran then, where everybody grew their own vegetables. Well, I would say to that person, if you want to grow your own vegetables, you can grow your own vegetables. You want to live someplace without electricity and air conditioning and no health care and never go to the doctor? You're free to do that. But why should you make the rest of the country go back to the 1800s? And that's really what a handful of people are trying to do. They can't do it legislatively. They can't do it through the courts. They can't do it politically. They can't win the elections on that basis. So they're trying to do it by holding a gun at our heads, keeping the government closed, threatening to default on the full faith and credit of the United States. But I just wanted to say in the few minutes I have remaining what another year-long sequester would mean in human terms. And this is things that come under the jurisdiction of my Appropriations Committee, which I have been privileged to chair or be ranking member of since 1989. And we've never had these kinds of problems before, Republicans or Democrats. Either when Republicans ran it or Democrats back, and I've been back and forth on this for many times in terms of Republicans chairing it, Democrats, Republicans, Democrats. We've never had these kind of problems. But if we go one more year, that means 100, under sequester, 177,000 fewer children will get Head Start services. 177,000. 1.3 million fewer students will get Title I education assistance. Now, what's Title I? That goes to the poorest kids, the poorest families, the poorest areas. 1.3 million low-income kids won't be helped. No, our kids will be fine. Kids of middle class, upper class, senators, congressmen, oh, man, they've got money. I'm talking about poor kids. 1.3 million. 760,000 fewer households will receive heating or cooling assistance under the LIHEAP program. And mostly that's elderly, poor people. 9,000 fewer special education staff will be in the classroom. In other words, under IDEA, we provide money for special education teachers and support staff for special education students. 9,000 will be cut. 9,000. $291 million less will be there for child care subsidies for working families, for people that need child care subsidies. They're low income, but they're going to work every day, but they need some child care help. $291 million cut away from that. How many will then not allow them to go to work? Or what will they do with those children? Will they put them in substandard child care facilities? One thing that is mind-boggling, we have a program in Medicare that goes after fraud, waste, and abuse. We know from the past that for every dollar that we put into that, we actually recover $7.90. I don't mean some phony kind of number. I mean we actually bring back $7.90 for every dollar we put into it. Well, because of the cut under sequester, that means in the next year there will be $2.7 billion that we will not recover. And by reducing the number of people in fraud, waste, and abuse section, that means that it just opens the door to fraud. People say, well, they're not there, they're not checking. Fraud. Now, people say, well, we're going to give them flexibility. Under sequester, there is no flexibility. That's got to be cut. And another year-long continuing resolution under sequester means $2 billion less for the National Institutes of Health, which means 1,300 fewer research grants. 1,300 fewer. So again, I just say that people say, well, we'll give flexibility. My colleagues on the other side says, well, we'll have sequester, but we'll leave flexibility to the departments. Well, let's see. Let's see how that goes. So the Administration for Children and Families, what would they do? Would they preserve Head Start slots by cutting child care subsidies? At NIH, would you preserve cancer research by cutting Alzheimer's research? These are terrible choices. Flexibility does not answer the questions. It's not the answer. Well, I would say one thing. When they cut flexibility, I know what's on their mind. It's military spending. Military spending. Now, everybody likes to talk about the sequester and the level of sequester, but you know what the House did? The sequester says it's 50-50, 50% cut from defense, 50% from non-defense discretionary. What the House did under the Ryan budget, they left defense whole and took it out of things like Head Start and IDEA, the special education and programs like that. They took it all out of there, but they left defense whole. That's not what was in sequester at all. So again, in my area of Health and Human Services, Education, Labor, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, NIH, that next year we would cut about $34 billion out of that, $34 billion. Now, people say, well, I don't know what that means. Well, as I said, I just told you what it meant. How many more kids will not be in Head Start? How many more families will not get child care subsidies? How many more research grants will not be funded by the NIH? And we will not have our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, epidemiologists, our teams out there watching for outbreaks of flu virus, foodborne illnesses, etc. So again, it's a disaster if we continue with a year-long sequester and a continuing resolution. That's why we need a short-term one, so our committees can go to work, perhaps cooler heads will prevail, and we can get a better budget for next year before the end of the year. To me, that's the way to proceed, Mr. President, and with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to commend the words of our chairman, the senior senator from Iowa, about his warnings about the impact of sequestration, the across-the-board indiscriminate cuts. We're grateful for that because we need to be thinking about what happens down the road when we have a budget agreement. Mr. President, I want to start today with just a brief comment on what happened earlier at about noontime. We had a vote, which was a procedural vote, which I was hoping would go in a different direction, but it didn't, to be able to move forward on the question of how we're going to avoid default. I don't think it's the last word on this issue for the next few days, but I was hoping that the Republicans would at least allow a debate of how we can avoid default. But so far that hasn't happened. But we're confident that in the next couple of days we'll resolve this. But I do think it's important that we lay a foundation for why we need to avoid default, because we've talked a lot about the consequences and the impact of a government shutdown, and that remains what might be called a clear and present danger to the middle class and to our economy. And at the same time, we have to talk about the consequences of default because we're only days away from the deadline. Maybe the best way to start is not with numbers, but with part of a letter I received from a constituent this week. The letter was dated October the 8th, so my assumption is that most of what's contained in this letter are fears about and the impacts from the shutdown only. The sentiments expressed in this letter will only grow in significance and severity as we get closer to the deadline and closer to default. And I'm reading just in pertinent part. This particular constituent from northeastern Pennsylvania, about an hour from where I live, but in the same basic region, talked about her own circumstances and that of her husband, and then she continued on. She said, and I'm quoting, "Besides our personal difficulties due to the budget impasse, my elderly parents live with the worry of when and if they will receive their Social Security checks. At 85 and 83, they should not have this uncertainty. These should be their golden years. It breaks my heart to hear my mother say she can't sleep and has a stomachache from the worry about where our country is headed. Middle and low-income families cannot afford another economic downturn. We are just barely recovering from the last one," unquote. That's what she said about her parents. Now, again, it's my assumption that the worry and the anxiety expressed in that paragraph is solely attributable, I should say, to the government shutdown. Those worries and anxiety, and frankly real pain, and there's physical pain expressed in that paragraph about her mother, that will only grow the closer we get to default, because we know the consequences of default are almost unimaginable, about the worst economic hit we could take as a country. So that's why we have to take every step necessary to avoid it. But I think that the words of a constituent from Pennsylvania speak, in this case, for the nation. Why should people have a worry, even if that worry is unfounded? We know that Social Security checks are going out now, thankfully, but they're slowed down substantially if there's a default. We know that even in a shutdown, if you reach the age of 65, it's going to take you a while to get the checks you're entitled to, because the process of validating your eligibility is held up. But why should there be that uncertainty? Why should any mother or father or a grandmother or grandfather have an anxiety and a worry that leads them to have a stomach ache in the case of what's the testimony in this letter, or they can't sleep because of a political agenda by one part of one political party in one house of Congress. So that's where things are with people's feelings and their anxieties, and we've got to be able to respond to that. The default question itself is of great significance now. Maybe 10 days ago it wasn't, but now, and I'm afraid we're into a period now where just the talk of default, just getting close to default, is going to have an adverse impact on our economy, which happened in 2011, and that's irrefutable. All of the data, all of the facts show that just getting close to default has an adverse impact on the economy. By one estimate, a recent estimate, almost a $20 billion hit to the economy if you measure it over 10 years. And there are all kinds of other consequences that I won't dwell on right now. But two statements made by Secretary of the Treasury Jack Lew in the Finance Committee, in his opening statement to the Finance Committee on Thursday morning. Two that I think we should be reminded of. Secretary Lew said, and I'm quoting, and this is in reference to the question of what if you go over the line on default and you have to decide which bills you pay, which is the wrong way to go, but he posited these two questions. How can the United States, and I'm quoting from him, how can the United States choose whether to send Social Security checks to seniors or pay benefits to our veterans? That's question one. Question two, how can the United States choose whether to provide children with food assistance or meet our obligations to Medicare providers? So they're the kind of questions that we're all going to have to answer if we allow, as some people apparently want us to do, to go over the line for the first time in American history. To say it's fiscal madness doesn't begin to describe it. Secretary Lew also said something else which we should contemplate today. He said, and I'm quoting, "It is irresponsible and reckless to insist that we experience a forced default to learn how bad it is." Because we've heard talk in this body and in the other body about what maybe we can survive if we go over the line. Maybe it's okay. Maybe we can prioritize payments. And I think we should be reminded of those words. To quote, insist, as some are insisting, apparently, to quote, insist that we experience a forced default to learn how bad it is, unquote. It makes no sense, and fortunately there's a consensus against it, but we still have work to do to prevent it from happening. I'll read as well a couple of lines from a letter that I received from a friend of mine who has spent a lot more years in the financial markets and has spent a lot of years trying to get both parties in Washington to come together on a fiscal agreement. But I'll just read some lines from this memo that he sent me. He was talking about the what happens with default. It's like any, if you default on your mortgage, if you default in your personal life, you have a credit problem. He said, and I'm quoting, from the standpoint of our credit worthiness, a default is a default. Once you have defaulted, you are and I'll leave the word out that he put in there because it may not be appropriate for this chamber, but I'll leave that blank. But I think people can figure out what a word or word might fit here. But you are a blank, and everyone fears that they will be the next party not to be paid. As in the Lehman bankruptcy, talking about the fall of 2008, as in the Lehman bankruptcy, the potential for unintended consequences that spiral out of control is enormous. In short, toying with default is not akin to playing with fire, but is more like handling financial weapons of mass destruction. It is a violation of the trust we place in our elected leaders to safeguard the welfare of our economy, unquote. I'm sorry, the welfare of our country, unquote. So that's what this person that I know has a lot of experience in the markets, how he describes what can happen in the event of default. Mr. President, I'll conclude with just some quick references to the impact of default as described by economists, as described by experts in the field of measuring the impact of default, folks who know a lot about what would happen. And I'll just read them as quickly as I can because we know some of these already, but we have to remind ourselves. Increasing borrowing costs. Many have talked and written about that. Damaging economic growth. Higher interest rates. Higher debt payments. Slow economic growth. One expert was talking about the Lehman bankruptcy and describing the Lehman bankruptcy and then putting that in the context of a default and making the case that a default has a much bigger impact than even the Lehman bankruptcy had. But just consider this. In 2008, the Lehman bankruptcy, quote, was an event that triggered the financial crisis that caused the stock market to lose half its value over just 5 months. Half its value over 5 months and helped to trigger the worst recession since the Great Depression. That was just the Lehman bankruptcy. Just imagine in the context of the fall how much worse it could be. Retirement savings. According to newer data, an equivalent hit could cost, comparing it to what happened in 2011, an equivalent hit could cost the average person in his or her 50s who's been saving for 20 or 30 years as much as $11,000. Mortgage payments would be hiked. After the 2011 shutdown, mortgage spreads jumped by 70 basis points, which would have added $100 per month to the cost of the typical mortgage. So we have data from 2011 that measures the adverse impact on mortgages just by getting close to default, not defaulting, not in the event of default itself. Disrupted payments. Delayed or disrupted payments would prevent 57.5 million Americans from receiving Social Security benefits in a timely manner and interfere with payments to 3.4 million veterans. And I'll just read two more. The Moody's chief economist, Mark Zandi, who has testified in front of the Senate many times, but parenthetically, as it relates to the shutdown, just testified yesterday that over in the House, because Joint Economic Committee is a joint committee, he testified that just as it relates to the shutdown, that he predicts that in this quarter we're in, the fourth quarter, we will have lost a half a point of growth. So instead of the GDP growth in the fourth quarter being 2.5%, as Mark Zandi would have predicted or projected, absent shutdown, with shutdown you go from 2.5% growth to 2% growth. That's just shutdown in one quarter. Just imagine the impact on growth if we defaulted. Here's what Mark Zandi says. I'm not quoting him. I am quoting him directly here. Quote, it would be, this is default, it would be devastating to the economy. And then he goes on to say, confidence will evaporate, consumer confidence will sharply decline, businesses will stop hiring, consumers will stop spending, the stock market will fall significantly in value, borrowing costs for businesses and households will rise. And he goes on from there, unquote. Look, you don't have to be an economist to know the impact of default. All you have to do is read what economists are saying across the board. These are people that disagree on a lot of things. They might disagree on a budget item. They might disagree on econometric modeling. They might disagree on tax cuts. They might disagree on a usual Democrat versus Republican approach to the economy. They might have fundamental disagreements on everything. But on this, they're speaking with one voice. Don't default, they're telling us. Don't even get close to defaulting. Don't even talk about or debate defaulting. Just prevent it from happening. And that is the overwhelming consensus. Let me conclude with one reference here. When I got to the Senate, one of the leading Republican voices on the budget, because he happened to be the ranking member on the Budget Committee, was Judd Gregg from New Hampshire. He'd been a governor of New Hampshire and then served in the Senate for many years. He has said recently that, talking about what would happen in the event of default, he said, and I'm quoting, that brinksmanship, I'm not quoting yet, I'm sorry, brinksmanship with the debt limit, quote, here's a quotation, is the political equivalent of playing Russian roulette with all of the chambers of the gun loaded. It's the ultimate no-win strategy. A default would lead to some level of chaos in the debt markets, which would lead to a significant contraction in economic activity, which would lead to job losses, which would lead to higher spending by the federal government and lower tax revenues, which would lead to more debt, unquote. So says the former ranking member of the Budget Committee, the former Republican senator from New Hampshire. So the idea that some think that for some reason we could go into default or even get close to it doesn't make a lot of sense. So, Mr. President, I'll conclude with this thought. That letter I started with from my constituent in Pennsylvania, who speaks for the country, I believe, when she was talking about her parents, her 82 and 83-year-old parents, about the uncertainty that they have, about the worry and the anxiety that's literally causing, in the case of her mother, according to this letter, physical pain. But even if it didn't rise to that level, just the idea that a government shutdown, and now coupled with the potential of default, just that is causing that kind of an anxiety, is really disturbing, and I think an insult to so many Americans. So we've got to come together and open the government at long last to make sure we pay our bills and not even get close to defaulting, and then we can have lots of negotiations and discussions for weeks or months about long-term issues, short-term issues, whatever. But in the meantime, we've got to make sure we pay our bills and open the federal government. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
The senator from Louisiana,
ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the roll.
without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, as we exited the chamber to go to our Democratic caucus, and I'm certain that the Republican colleagues and friends were talking among themselves as well, trying to find a way forward, a reporter stopped me and said, "What do you think the Senate's going to do, Senator Landrieu?" I said, "Well, I don't know the specifics. I'm most certainly hopeful and remain cautiously optimistic that the Senate will step up to the job at hand and to fulfill the promise or the hopes of our founders that created the Senate to operate in times just like these, where there seems to be no way forward, to find a way forward, where the political winds have gotten so bitter and cold, for us to be able to come together, the 100 of us, to find a way forward to help keep our economy whole and operating and functioning well, not just for our nation but for the world, which is important, to help support and bolster the recovery that is underway, to set aside, the bitterness and the rancor and try to find a way forward. So I am very encouraged, despite the fact that the vote was, very divisive, all Republicans on one side, all Democrats on the other. I am confident because I know the members of this body well and have been here long enough to know that there are many people of goodwill on both sides of the aisle that can try to find a way forward, and I know that the President of the United States is open to negotiation. Now, maybe we can find resolution within the political parties, but that's not what's important. What's important is finding a resolution in the Senate of the United States for all of the people of the United States. We do not represent narrow districts with narrow ideologies. We represent states, big ones like California, medium-sized ones like Louisiana, and small ones like Delaware. But inside of Delaware, inside of Louisiana, and inside of California, there are people of all different political persuasions. And as senators, when we run for office, we have to listen and take all of that in and then try to make the best decisions we can. And it's an honor to serve in the Senate. Even though it's tough, it's hard, it's very difficult at times. And I've been proud to serve here for now 18 years and be among many groups that have found compromise, that have found the middle ground, that have tried to work to understand where the other side is coming from and move our country forward. It has not always, been perfect, and none of us are perfect here. But I'm proud that I've at least been one to say, count on me to try to see what we can do to resolve the situation. So I want to say that today for my constituents. That's what they want me to do. That's what they sent me here for 18 years ago, and what I know they want me to continue to do. Now, I do feel strongly on their behalf that the government should open, and the 21,000 of them that have been wrongly laid off by actions by a minority, the government needs to open. The debt most certainly needs to be honored of the United States so this economic recovery can continue. But there are plenty of things that we can negotiate. The debt of the country is too high. We do need to have some earned benefit and potential, entitlement reform, not necessarily cutting out benefits from people that count on them for the government to do their part to meet people halfway. But there are always efficiencies that can be created if we work together. So I see that the leader is on the floor, but I just wanted, before the Senate closed, to come and say on behalf of the constituents that I represent, I am very hopeful that we can find a way forward. I think that Senator Lead has been providing extraordinary leadership, and hopefully we can find a way forward. And I will just briefly, in 30 seconds, mention that there have been some very good conversations that have gone on about the funding of the city of Washington, not a part of the federal government. That has not been resolved yet, but Republicans and Democrats and the White House are working together to find a way for the District of of Columbia, the city of Washington, with its own mayor and city council, its own budget, its own local funds, does not have to be caught up in a very tough circumstance that is not of their making, and they are not part of the federal government. Neither is New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore. We are separate cities, and they should be treated that way. We haven't found a way yet, but we're working on it. I see the leader on the floor, and I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I appreciate the kind words of the senator from Louisiana, but I want the record spread with the work that she's done, that I have seen in our years together in the Senate. No one has been more of an advocate for a state than the senior senator from Louisiana. What she's done after that terrible hurricane hit that area is now legendary. The ability that she had to change what had been standard procedures and law in this country for decades. We changed that for a lot of reasons. One is her advocacy. We did it because of her. In fact, the Democrats in the Senate voted for things that they never voted for before because of the good senator from Louisiana. And it wasn't done to help on a temporary basis, but long-term for the state of Louisiana. I hope they understand what a difference one person can make, because she's made a difference, and she's changed things forever in Louisiana already. And I'm sure the best is yet to come. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent. Senator be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Yeah. Mr. President, as most know now, we did a press event. Everybody knows, I guess, but I'm going to say it again. I had a meeting with Senators McConnell, Alexander, and Schumer this morning to work on the issues before us. The conversations are preliminary, but they're talking, and we're talking, and I hope everyone understands how positive this is. It's the first discussions we've had here, period, during the whole pendency of this artificially driven government shutdown and not raising the debt ceiling when we should. So I am confident that Senator McConnell understands that defaulting our debt would risk millions of jobs in the United States. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions. It would halt Social Security checks, Medicare payments, and even paychecks for our men and women in uniform. Senators, they were Democrat. We agree with Senator Obama, and we share a simple goal. We want to reopen the government and pay our bills so we can move forward with a good faith negotiation on a long-term budget to protect jobs, the middle class, and the American economy. That is our goal. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Energy Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-812.
Clerk will report.
S-812, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to take actions to implement the agreement between the United States of America and the United Mexican States concerning transboundary hydrocarbon reservoirs in the Gulf of Mexico.
Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask consent the bill be read a third time passed. Motion to consider be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I am told that H.A. Res. 76 is now at the desk and due for activity.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.J. Resolution 76, making continuing appropriations for the National Nuclear Security Administration for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I object. I would first ask for a second reading and then object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will be read for a second time on the next legislative day.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, business day adjourned until 1 p.m. tomorrow, Sunday, October 13th. and the following prayer and the pledge in the morning hour be deemed expired. The journal of proceedings be approved to date. The time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 1 p.m. tomorrow.
And as we just heard, the Senate back tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Earlier on the floor, senators blocked a bill that was offered by the majority leader would have suspended the debt limit through the end of next year. And we'll have more live Senate coverage when the gavel comes down here on C-SPAN 2. Going to head back to Book TV.